The HA-FDX1 dual carbon earphone is Massdrop's collaboration with JVC to make official the community mods done by owners of the original HA-FD1 earphone. Instead of getting one stainless steel, one titanium and one brass filter, the latter two are replaced with two new sets of stainless steel filters, which supposedly do the same thing as the original community mods, while the rest of the earphone remains unchanged, barring some slight visual differences. So with the power of company-endorsed mods, is this earphone worth $250? Let's find out together, but before that, this is Earphoneus Fanaticus, and in this video, I'll present you my detailed review of the JVC HA-FDX1. Let's begin with the physical design. This earphone looks identical to the FD01, so just like what I said in the beginning, the only difference is the filters that come with the earphone. So if you have seen the FD01 before, you'll know exactly what this one's like. The casing is made entirely of stainless steel, and despite it being assembled from different parts, I don't see any uneven edges in between, so there's really nothing to complain about in terms of build quality. I also like the matte gunmetal finish on the majority of the earpiece, which of course complements the shinier parts really well. Speaking of shiny parts, the filter can be easily changed by pulling back a tiny notch. This allows you to turn the filter slightly and remove it. And when you want to put a filter back on, align this marking with the tiny indent on the earpiece, then turn it clockwise. The notch will then lock the filter in with a very faint click. This is a super elegant design that works really well and is very fast to do, unlike on AKG earphones where you have to literally unscrew the filter out and then screw the filter back on. I would love to see more manufacturers do something like this. The filter also functions as the nozzle, which is around 6 to 6.5mm at the widest. The opening is no slouch either, measuring at around 5mm, which is only marginally smaller than the champion in my collection, the Unique Melody Maverick. The updated version of the extremely popular SpinFit CP100, for example, is only most suited for 4mm wide nozzles. So you can imagine finding an ear tip that perfectly fits this earphone is quite challenging, though the earphone already comes with another popular tip, the Spiral Dot Plus, which is also made by JVC. Looking at the back, we can see the model name, Drop HA-FDX1 Dual Carbon, which is different from the FD01 that reads HA-FD01 DLC Dome Dual Carbon. We'll get back to the nomenclature later on. It can also be seen that JVC has gone with some kind of spiral pattern here, which reminds me of the underside of a frying pan. Weird association, yes, but having to do the dishes every day in order to avoid going to the restaurants does change your worldview a bit. Now the entire back assembly can actually be turned, and the reason is, this allows the user to choose how they want to wear the earphone. Say if you want to wear it like traditional in-ear monitors such as Shure and Westone, you can turn the assembly 180 degrees so that the cable goes up, or if you just want to wear it earbud style, you can turn it again so the cable goes down. This also means there's no left or right earpiece. Both sides can be left or right, so after you plug in the left channel and the right channel, you just need to adjust them so that they fit into your left and right ears respectively. Very interesting design that confused the heck out of me the first time around, because when I unboxed it, I thought Massdrop gave me two of the same pieces. But anyway, going back to the different wearing style, for those who need eyeglasses, you'll be stuck with the earbud style because the cable tends to fall off after bumping into the arm of the eyeglasses a few times. Speaking of wearing the earphone, I find it acceptably comfortable to use if ignoring the earpiece's relative heft. One thing I hate about earphones is that sometimes manufacturers completely forget that there are actually curvatures to our ears instead of it being a completely flat surface, so they end up making the medial side rather edgy and just in general painful to use. JVC, on the other hand, takes note of this and makes sure the medial side is very rounded. But one thing JVC kind of failed at is to also ensure the lateral side is rounded as well. The edge here can push against the concha, or here, so depending on the space you have here, the earphone can get painful to use in long listening sessions. Isolation wise, I can have it sitting quite intimately in my ears, though of course it's not as fitting as something like my UERR, which covers a bigger area of the outer ear. And exactly because of this, isolation on this earphone actually comes mostly from the ear tip you use. I would say isolation when paired with the ML size tips are quite good, but not as good as something like the Massdrop Plus or the UERR, which are both more form-fitting to the ears thanks to their custom-like design. Something I find a bit odd is that there is a vent port on the medial side of the earpiece. The vent port itself is not surprising to see because it can be found in most, if not all, earphones using dynamic drivers, even for the likes of hybrid earphones. I'm not really sure what it's for, but I read from a Reddit comment that, depending on where the port is located, volume of the bass can be tuned. In the case of a front port, a bass drop-off can be created. Regardless of the science behind, I'm really just wondering that wouldn't the ports be blocked by our ears anyway? Maybe JVCs themselves didn't intend us to wear the earphone so close to the ear canal, but then isolation would suffer. This might be just a non-existent dilemma I created in my head. Well, moving on. Let's briefly touch on the filters. Like I said in the beginning, we get 3 stainless steel filters labeled white, green, and blue. White is identical to the stainless steel filter of the original earphone, while green and blue are 2 versions of community mods. They both have this cotton material lining the internal, but on closer inspection, we can see that in the green filter, the material pretty much covers the entire inner wall, while in the blue filter, the material only covers around half of the inner wall. We'll see how they change the sound when we get to sound impression analysis, but for now, I think the fact that JVC agreed to make these custom filters is like a nod by the company to acknowledge the community's achievement in improving their product. I just kind of wish these along with the titanium and brass filters can be sold separately, so those who have the original but doesn't bother to do the mod themselves can easily buy the supposedly better filters, while people like me who don't own the original can complete the collection without buying another earphone that's 99.9% similar to the FDX1. The earphone houses a DLC Dome Dual Diaphragm driver. Wait, DLC Dome Dual Diaphragm driver. That's a lot of Ds. But if you prefer a different assortment of Ds, you can also call it the D3 driver, which stands for dignified, distinct, and delightful. Really flexing the Ds, vocabularies here, JVC. Now, what this really is describing how the driver uses 2 layers of carbon, which are diamond-like carbon, aka DLC, as well as carbon black. PET and PEN are also used, which in total means the driver is made of 4 layers of materials. JVC claims this makes the driver tough yet flexible, and they seem really happy with how the driver came out. The driver is installed in a titanium case, which is unique to FD01 out of JVC's Class S Solid Edge lineup. Looking at more technical specs, the rated frequency response ranges from 8 Hz to 52 kHz, so this earphone is definitely high-res capable if you care about that sort of thing. Impedance is rated at 16 ohms, and according to the 1/8 rule, output impedance can be no greater than 2 ohms. You might not want to plug this earphone directly into your desktop or laptop's audio port if you want it to sound as JVC designed, but using it with smartphones or most DAPs out there should be mostly fine because their impedance tend to sit below that anyway. I say tend to because obviously I don't have the data for all sources, but at least phones like iPhone has a history of having near zero impedance, and most people use iPhones these days. Generalizing a lot here, but hopefully you see my point. Sensitivity is rated at 103 dB per 1 mW, which sits rather low in my chart here, but don't be fooled into thinking this earphone is hard to drive. In fact, I find the similarly spec'd OnQ E900M with the same impedance and high sensitivity actually sounds softer than the JVC. Anyway, if we just look at the numbers without considering the level of loudness we hear, the rated sensitivity implies that this earphone is not likely to show hissing from the source. Overall, I say that while this earphone does require a relatively high-quality source, it's not as hard to pair as something like the K3003 with its crazy low 8 ohms impedance, and at the same time, it is actually relatively easy to drive despite what the sensitivity might have you believe. The earphone comes with an MMCX cable that terminates with a straight-angle 3.5mm jack. The MMCX socket on the earphone is not particularly strong or weak, so the cable can turn around quite easily, but there's actually pretty much no wiggling I can feel, and audio doesn't cut out when I move my head around, so the MMCX connection gets the job done. The coating is smoky black with grooves that feel quite nice to the touch. The material of the metal wires inside is 4N or 99.99 oxygen-free copper. Copper is typically chosen for its low resistivity. Silver is slightly better, but it's quite a bit more expensive as well. There's no mention of lid braiding, and when looking at either of the channel, it's a bit hard to tell through the coating whether the wires are insulated. I would have to guess yes, because one of the wires is black, and copper is definitely not black. In the lower half where the wires from the left and the right channels come together, it seems there's some plastic running along that separates the two sides. JVC seems to have marketed this as a feature that improves channel separation and offers excellent spatial expression. But I'm fairly certain this is something that must be done by design in order to achieve dual-channel audio, meaning most of the other guys have been doing this for many years already. By construction, the cable doesn't look like your exotic audiophile cable, but to be honest, it still feels quite good to use. However, I do have to say that because of its bulkiness, more cable noise comes through, which can be quite annoying when you use it on the go, especially when your clothes rub against the coating. And of course, this is not helped by the use of metal and the choker and the wire split. Speaking of the choker, because the cable is not braided, the choker slides smoothly without being too loose. Now this is probably a good time for me to bring up the horrendous choker of the Massdrop Plus, but to its credit, it is braided cable, so okay, no beating the dead Massdrop horse again. For now. One thing I find quite interesting is that JVC for some reason found it necessary to put China on the choker. You would think JVC on the wire split is already enough. Barring any geopolitical biases, it's just kind of weird to put it here. I'll be fine with no prints at all like the 3.5mm audio jack. Look how clean it is. By the way, there's clearly an effort to relieve bending stress here, so I wouldn't worry too much about the longevity of it. To be frank, I can say the same for the whole earphone even. Everything is high quality, well constructed and feels durable. I can confidently say this is the toughest earphone out of my collection, and as such I have zero issue using it as my daily beater. A $250 beater. Yeah, a bit expensive for that purpose, but I can use it knowing full well it's just not gonna die on me. That has to worth more than $250. The earphone comes with 5 sets of spiral dot ear tips from XS to XL, which I do consider as a step up above the generic silicone tips you get with 99.9% of earphones out there. I haven't noticed too many differences between these and the original spiral dots aside from there being more material underneath, the edge of the opening looking a little sharper, and the dots inside seem a little bit more indented and prominent. And just like what I said initially, the material is still a little sticky than the original and might be a tiny bit softer. I haven't made A/B comparison between the two in terms of sound, and for the sake of releasing this review more quickly, I'm gonna stick with the Plus version for now and maybe come back to do a sound comparison video if I find any significant difference. You also get a carrying case. I might have said how much I liked the feel on hand during my first look video, but having had it for more than 3 months, the feeling of faux leather is real, and it really just isn't something anyone would obsess over. It opens like a clamshell, which is a lot more convenient to use on the go than those with a screw-on lid. There's not much padding inside to speak of, but the felt material should help reduce scratches when the earphone bumps around inside. Besides this and the filters as well as the Spiral Dot Plus, you don't get any cleaning tool or attenuator like you normally do with other IEMs. Personally, it's not a huge problem because I've got a lot of those already, but you might feel a bit robbed, especially considering the $250 price tag. But do the other aspects of the entire package make up for the relative lack of accessories? I mean, just looking at the actual quality of the earpieces themselves as well as the nicely constructed cable that feels tough on hand, I really feel quite impressed and certainly have high hopes for its sound quality. If it excels in that aspect, which arguably is also the most important of them all, I think we might be just looking at a truly fantastic product that can be easily recommended to a lot of people. So why don't we get into that already? Well, I would and I should, but let me just quickly tell you about my auditioning setup. As usual, I'm using my OnQ DP-X1A as the source, ACG mode on, loud range adjust at +2, the digital filter set to sharp. I also used Tidal for additional auditioning, as well as my PC Chord Mojo setup for tests like bass rattling and perceived dynamic range. As for the earphone, I'll be using the stock cable, ml size of the included Spiral Dot Plus tips, as well as the blue filter, which is the filter that cuts down the most upper mids. More on this later. There are really just so many aspects of sound quality we can talk about, but to get a general sense, let's begin with sound signature. Starting with bass, despite the fact that JVC has rated the lowest boundary to be 8Hz, I can only hear the bass starting from around 20Hz. By ears, I think the bass slowly increases in volume up until around 150Hz, which gets quite loud for me, then it weakens slightly towards 200Hz. This is not to say that there's a sharp drop at 200Hz, but rather it just doesn't sound as loud as the lower frequencies I mentioned. In terms of actual listening experience, I think the bass response can be summarized as neutral bass with slight warmth. I say this because coming from the UER, which has practically ruler flat bass, I think the FDX1 is just a little bit stronger, so it sounds more dynamic and exciting. Music such as hip-hop, rock, metal, those kind of things will benefit from it. However, don't think of the FDX1 as some sort of bass monster. Gone are the days when dynamic driver earphones must have fat bass and poor resolution. The FDX1 is so tastefully tuned that it's really just a little north of neutral in this range. Think of what JVC did here as the difference between ER4SR and ER4XR, just a little boost to make things more exciting. Extension towards sub-bass is similar to the UERR with adequate amount, so you can definitely hear the really deep rumble in the music from time to time. Though arguably, something like the AKG N5005 would do better here because it's got even more bass, but the N5005 is also a lot more expensive. Besides, when you're out and about listening to music, you mostly wouldn't hear the sub-bass anyway because the background noise will just drown it out. This can be somewhat resolved by having better isolation, but without a custom-like fit, this would just never be possible. Finally, I do not hear any bass rattling even when the volume is turned way up, so this means the driver is mounted properly. Overall, I really like how the FDX1 performs here. While those who crave bass will be left wanting more if you expect the dynamic driver in this earphone to act like the traditional ones, those who prefer it to be audible but not overwhelming will find a lot of enjoyment out of this earphone. Moving on to the mid-range, which arguably has the most significant effect on sound signature due to important musical elements such as vocals and melodic line falling into this range, I think the lower mids is a little leaner than most dynamic driver earphones, so you'll find things like cello taking a cleaner tone but with less richness. If you're looking for something that can recreate the reverberation and rich tone of a cello, you'll be disappointed, though you might also find yourself noticing more of the bowing texture. This is caused by the significant elevation in the upper mids. Manufacturers tend to add some boost there to bring more clarity to the whole mid-range, meaning things like female vocals or vocals that are just in general higher pitched have a stronger presence. I really enjoy the boost in clarity as a result of the upper mids elevation because I can notice more hidden elements that I might not notice with other IEMs, and I can have a clearer grasp of what a sound element is actually textured to be like. Now, I really do have to stress that the FDX1 is one of the best, if not the best IEM out of my collection in terms of vocal quality. It shows fantastic details from the singers, any subtleties like breathing, shaping or vocal line, dynamics, emotion, everything can be appreciated to the fullest degree with this earphone. Now, if you're more into artists like Travis Scott or Drake, this level of detail would not be something you have to worry about, but if you like music that's less processed and slower paced, you will definitely appreciate having this earphone by your side. But coming back to the upper mids elevation, besides enhancing vocals, it also means the melody ends up taking a back seat, especially during busy passages in the music. It almost feels like it's not just the lower mids that's somewhat lacking in presence, but it's more like the mids is just in general recessed a bit, giving the earphone a bit of the rock EQ quality. Coming from a reference the UERR, which also has upper mids elevation but to a lesser degree, I really can't say definitively for other people what kind of signature is better. If you're someone who enjoys a more body presence of the background, you might want to look for something else that's more melodic, or more specifically, something with less upper mids. But if you're the type that likes to sit down and catch all the little details, the FDX1 really can't be beat. Another thing that must be pointed out regarding the upper mids is that it turns out the reason why people modded their FD01 was to try to quell this range. The blue and green filters included for the FDX1 I'm reviewing here exist for the same exact reason, with the blue filters cutting out more than the greens. I prefer the blue ones the most, because even with the green ones they're still a little too much. And of course, if you buy the FDX1, you should not use the white filters because A, the earphone gains too much clarity from it, and B, you can get it with the non-Massdrop version anyway. Let's move on to the treble. JVC claims the earphone can play up to 52 kHz, which of course I have no way to verify, simply because I'm not a dolphin. But I do think that when it comes to doing frequency sweeps from top to bottom in this range, you can start to hear a very faint, high-pitched sound starting from 19 kHz, which becomes very audible at 16K, and it steadily increases in volume till around 13K, which is quite loud but dips noticeably at around 11 to 10K, followed by the volume creeping back up when reaching 9 kHz. Realistically, we only have to look at how the 10K is tuned and maybe 16K as well, but high frequency response is something I always challenge myself to describe. Anyway, for those who prefer something more musical than sine waves, I think the treble from the FDX1 is quite fast and shows no smearing unlike Massdrop's in-house earphone, the Plus IEM. So obviously you can expect good transients with cymbals, percussions, that kind of thing. In terms of sound signature, the treble is not exactly the kind that I lust over. Similar to what I said in my UER review, what I really prefer is a very crispy and airy kind of treble. To be more precise, I like having sharp peaks in places anywhere from 7K to 10K, as well as at 16K. It's the kind of quality you can hear from earphones like the OnQ E900M, Unique Melody Maverick or AKG N5005. Though I suspect what the FDX1 shows will be better aligned with what most people like. I just have weird taste in this range, so I can't fault the FDX1 for taking a more mainstream approach. Still, if your preference is similar to mine, you might get a little disappointed when drums are not as well represented when listening to metal. I'm not saying the FDX1 is dull or anything. No, far from it. It's just that you might find some percussion instruments like cymbals to be more hidden. Now, you might think that the upper mids elevation might bleed a little into the treble range and cause more sibilance issues, but it turns out despite how full of detail the treble is, there's really no sibilance in my ears. So all in all, treble performance gets a seal of approval from me despite it not exactly matching what I like, but I'm sure most people will be satisfied by it. Besides sound signature, I think it's also important to talk about soundstage and layering. Because of the slight angle of the nozzle and distance of the driver away from the outlet, I think the horizontal soundstage is only a hair narrower than the legendary Sony MDR-EX1000, which happens to be the widest sounding earphone in my collection. Realistically, without the Sony to AB against, I wouldn't have been able to tell you the difference anyway. Horizontal layering receives high marks as well for being able to recreate set layers without drowning. Vertical soundstage is quite tall too, due mostly to the width of the nozzle and the size of the driver, though the earphone's bias in sound signature sometimes makes the headspace feel a little bit empty. Besides, with only one driver it's impossible to achieve any kind of vertical layering. Anyway, the tall soundstage is probably the reason why sound elements are not imaged as points, but rather as silhouettes. As such, it might be hard to see the sound. You might hear them from general directions rather than as discrete points in the headspace. This combining with the good horizontal layering I mentioned just now creates a bit of a weird situation, where the weak imaging bottlenecks the strong layering effect. So while you can clearly tell there are sounds coming from different angles, you can't really feel concretely how big those sounds are, which is why I said they sound more like silhouettes with faded edges than points. But all in all, I would still say the imaging is not bad. It can be very revealing when sound signature allows it, especially in the mids to upper mids range. Let's also quickly touch on dynamic range. I don't have any scientific way to measure it, so this section is only done by ears. I'm able to reach 72 decibels of dynamic range with the FDX1, which ranks it really high in this chart because most of my other earphones just kinda sit at 66 decibels. Still, it's matched by the Dannu DK3001 and bested by the EX1000 at 78 decibels. Now, to realistically enjoy the wide dynamic range, you do need to turn up the volume and also have a quiet background. Without either one, you're still not likely to be able to hear the contrast between the loudest and softest sounds in the music. In other words, dynamic range is just something interesting to talk about, though realistically it might not be super important to us. That's all for sound quality analysis. The next section will be focusing on ear tip compatibility. I have a bunch of major third-party tips such as Comply, Spiral Dots, many flavors of SpinFit thanks to, well, SpinFit, and even rare stuff like Sony hybrids or foam hybrids, or even the final E-type which I have yet to do a review on. But with the gargantuan size of the nozzle, I can only limit this section down to a few tips, including the SpinFit CP100, 145, 155, 500, Comply Isolation, and Comply Comfort. Let's start with the SpinFit CP100 and 145. I group these together because they have the same effect on the earphone. Comparing to the Spiral Dot Plus tips that come with the earphone, these two SpinFit models give a little bit more presence to the mids and makes the sound signature overall warmer. This might be preferable to those who find the FDX1 a bit too V-shaped for their liking. Bass also gets some healthy improvements as it sounds firmer and has better extension towards the lower registers. Because of the length of these tips, sounds will be more closed in comparing with the stock tips. Between CP100 and 145, there are really no discernible differences in terms of sound. Shape-wise, they are identical, but the CP145 does feature a longer flange. This means if you can achieve good seal with either tip, the difference in flange really shouldn't matter much. But speaking of seal, I do find the CP145 to be more natural fitting in my ears, and it is easier to put on thanks to its wider opening on the bottom, while the CP100 looks like it's not supposed to be fitted on the earphone. Regardless, I think these tips are both good match for the FDX1, but the CP145 is more favored simply because of the slightly better fitting and its larger bottom opening. Moving on to the CP155, shape-wise it is pointier and longer than the CP100 and 145. The bottom opening is big, so it can be easily fitted onto the FDX1. When put onto the earphone, the tip does go very deep, which can be irritating for some. In terms of sonic differences, I'm not a fan of the CP155 because it decreases the focus on the mid-highs, which is the thing that makes the earphone detailed sounding. Treble also becomes less crisp, which is deleterious to cymbals or drums just in general. I think a good way to describe what the tip does overall is that it makes the earphone sound slightly veiled, but in return you do get a little bit more bass. All in all, I don't think the CP155 is a good match in terms of sound differences. What I do think is a fantastic match for the FDX1 is the CP500. It features the largest opening out of all SpinFits, though nowhere near the size of the Spiral Dots. It fits like the CP100 or 145 in the ears, though the large sheet of material that make up the flange can make fitting a little bit finicky. I recommend a shallow fit when paired with the FDX1. Anyway, there are a few reasons why I like these so much with this earphone. Firstly, it is the one that gives the greatest boost to sub-bass volume and extension in the form of rumbling, though it somehow remains crispy and not overpowering. It's more of the embellishing kind if you will, and the same can be said for treble as well. Again, crispy but not distracting. Unlike the CP155, these tips do not take away much from the earphone's strength in upper mids clarity, and like the CP100 and 145, these tips also make the earphone warmer sounding. All in all, if you like bass, slightly more mids and retain the crispiness in treble from the stock Spiral Dot tips, you'll want to pair the CP500 with your FDX1. Moving on to some foam tips, let's talk about Comply T series, or what's now called the Isolation series. While it does fit, you do have to kinda jam the nozzle in, but that's not a problem really. Amongst the tips I tried with the FDX1, I think this specific tip makes the earphone the loudest, probably because the tip itself is long and gives the best seal, but it can be irritating after a short listen. In terms of sonic differences, I think bass extension, strength and firmness are all increased by a healthy amount, but it is by no means overpowering again. Treble and mid-high on the other hand sound less prominent and not as crispy as the stock tips or the CP500. Besides differences in sound signature, because the opening is only a hair smaller than the stock tips, the earphone's tall soundstage, good horizontal layering combined with Comply's perfect seal lead to good headspace and awesome imaging. So all in all, I do think this tip is another fantastic choice for the FDX1 if it wasn't for the typical annoyances in using Comply, such as having to squeeze the tip every time before listening, the foam bouncing back too quickly with repeated use, and just in general being bulkier than other tips which can hurt comfort. I do think most of the sonic improvements could have stemmed from the increased loudness I mentioned earlier. The louder, the better, after all. Last tip I want to touch on is the Comply Comfort series, which is a lot more rounded than the Isolation series. This tip is even bulkier than the previous one, so if you don't like wearing that one, you'll most certainly hate these ones. For some reason, it doesn't have the same loudness effect, and I feel there's more veiling in the upper mid, which hurt the earphone's clarity. Bass also doesn't see the same degree of improvements from the other Comply tips. Dynamics also suffer a little, especially when comparing to the CP500 or, once again, the Comply Isolation tips, so the earphone sounds a little bit flatter in terms of volume. The only upside I can think of is that it does make the FDX1 warmer sounding comparing to the stock tips. But overall, I don't recommend pairing this tip with the earphone. If you really want to use Complies, just go with the Isolation series, which is the pointier one out of the two. As I arrive at the 8th page of the scripts for this super long review, what are my final thoughts of the JVC HA-FDX1 earphone? To put everything shortly, I think this earphone definitely is a worthy purchase. Starting from the outside, the earphone is made of solid feeling metal, which makes it super sturdy and hardy feeling, though some might not like its big housing. The rotating assembly is the first of its kind that I've seen in earphones, which allows for a semi-customized fit, anywhere from adjusting how the nozzle should sit in the ear canal to straight up changing the cable orientation. But for people who wear glasses, there's only one way to set the cable, which is to have it drape down like earbuds. The filter, which also functions as the nozzle, can be taken off with the click of a notch, which again is ahead of other IEM solution that requires tedious screwing and unscrewing. And while the cable is just as heavy and bulky as the earpieces, it again feels like it can take a beating, though cable noise is extremely bad and can pop up with the slightest body movement. But overall, this earphone deserves high marks for cool designs and quality material. Sound quality on the other hand is a bit complicated. Beginning with sound signature, even though there are 3 filters provided, I end up sticking mostly to the blue filter, which is the one version of community mods that cut out the most upper mids. But even still, the earphone sounds colder and more analytical than what you might expect of dynamic driver earphones, which are the results of the obvious focus on the upper mids. Yes, that focus is still very much present even if you're already using the blue filter. Some might be okay with this depending on what earphone you came from, but I came from the UERR, which is one of the flattest sounding earphones you can get, so to me, yeah, the upper mids can be a bit much. But fortunately, this can be fixed up rather easily by switching from the stock Spiral Dot Plus tips to certain SpinFit and Comply models which boost bass and melody slightly, leading to a much more balanced sound signature overall. This is very important, because if you can't hear the mids well, you'll want to crank up the volume just to hear more of the melody, but you also end up boosting the upper mids, which again is already quite abundant to begin with. Still, this is a common problem to all V-shaped sounding earphones, and the FDX1 suffers the least from it, if the blue filter is what you use with it. What is truly deserving of high praise is this perceived clarity, which funnily enough is also created by the upper mids elevation. To quote what I said earlier, this is one of those earphones where you will hear a lot more things in the music that might be otherwise hidden in other earphones. Texturing, especially with vocals, is one of the best I've heard, and so if your music library mostly consists of genres with slow, expressive singing, or if you're the type of people who like to pick up the little subtleties in the singer's breathing, articulation, emotion, etc., the FDX1 can't be beat. This, along with easy fixes in the sound signature by changing ear tips, is the reason why I don't have any problem recommending this earphone. With the Spiral Dot Plus, what you get is a signature that's somewhat cold but analytical in the upper mids, but with some tip rolling, you can bring back some bass and mids, allowing the earphone to become something that's more balanced and analytical. Comparing to Massdrop's attempt at designing their earphone, the Massdrop Plus, even though the FDX1 is $50 more expensive, what you get for the price premium is something that will last and doesn't actually sound terrible for the price. Sure, you can try a few ear tips with the Plus as well, but the starting line is so much lower that no tip will be able to save the Plus to the point where it becomes anywhere as worthy as the FDX1. And before I beat on the dead horse any further, I'm going to end the review here. $250 is a bit of an investment for some, but you'll definitely enjoy it. So, buy it, try it, and enjoy a world of vocal clarity in your earphone journey. Oh, and don't forget to try different tips with it. This is going to be it for this review. If you find it useful or entertaining, don't forget to like and share the video. And if you have any question, please let me know in the comment section. I would also love to know what you think of it. Anyway, I'll come back with yet another earphone review. Hopefully I'll see you again in the next video. Goodbye friends.